Thank you. Thank you very much for this very generous introduction. So it's a delight to be here tonight to talk to you about my work on income inequality, showing you evidence and discussing policy implications. So let me motivate the topic. So as we all know, free market economies have generated substantial economic growth, but they also generate inequality. And this has traditionally been indeed the main criticism of free market capitalistic society. And so this raises two important issues for economists and for society at large. So first is the issue of measuring and understanding inequality. What is the level of inequality? How does it evolve over time? And what factors are explaining the evolution of inequality? And then second, there are a set of normative questions about the proper role of the government in regulating inequality. So should the government reduce inequality using redistributive policies such as taxes, transfers, and other regulations? So tonight I will discuss some of those aspects, focusing on the top of the income distribution. That is, looking at income concentration and looking at policies geared towards the top, that is the proper taxation of top incomes. So a simple way to measure inequality is to compute what we call top income shares, that is what share of total pre-tax market income goes to various groups in the income distribution, such as the top 10%, top 1%, etc. So the focus on pre-tax market income means that we're interested in understanding how the market distributes economic resources before the government does substantial redistribution through taxes and transfers. And so what we've been using are income tax statistics that are a very valuable source to construct such inequalities series over a long time period and across countries, because most advanced economies have had progressive income taxes for over a century. Actually, the US is just celebrating the 100th anniversary of the federal individual income tax that started in 1913 after a constitutional amendment. And so the existence of those income taxes also provide economists great data, because countries have compiled statistics of income taxes showing you the distribution of taxpayers, and that's what we've used to construct those inequality series. So we've done that work for the United States with my colleague Thomas Piketty, and since then a large number of countries, actually about 25 countries, have been analyzed by a number of researchers. That's really a collective effort, and that we've put together all those data in what we call the World Top Income Database. So you can go online and you would get something like this, where you can click on countries and you see the countries in red have been studied. So you see it's mostly advanced economies, North America, Western Europe, and we've started looking at a few developing countries like China and India, and a number of countries in blue are work in progress. So what I want to do today is show you the main findings we've obtained from this big collective research effort, and then talk about tax policy regarding top income. So let me start then showing you evidence from the United States. So what this chart shows you is the evolution of the top of the share of income going to the top 10% since 1917 in the United States. So remember, this is pre-tax market income. So typically the income that you would report on your tax return. And so what you can see is that the shape has the form of a U with high levels of income concentration, with the top 10% getting about 45% to 50% of total income, a precipitous drop during World War II, and then for decades a much lower level of income concentration, with the top 10% getting about 33%. And finally, what is striking is the upswing that has taken place starting in the late 70s, where the top 10% income share has increased dramatically, reaching a peak of almost 50%, the highest ever, at least over that century in 2007. The next thing I want to point out from this chart is that there are ups and downs, indeed, that correspond to the business cycle. So this is the dot-com crash of 2000, 2002. This is the Great Recession. But what I want to point out is that the business cycle, and in particular the Great Recession, will have at best a modest effect on income concentration. So you see they fell. They've started to increase again in 2010, 2011. But no matter what, the change that happens due to the business cycle, you can see that it is very small relative to the secular decades-long change that has taken place since the 1970s. The second very striking fact about this surge in income concentration is how concentrated precisely the phenomenon has been. So the simplest way to see that is to actually decompose the top 10% into three groups. The top 1%, so this is the series here in black, share of income going to the top 1%. The next 4%, that is the series in blue. And then the next 5%, the series in red. So just to give you an idea, in 2011, the top 1% are families with income above $367,000. The next group, between 155 and 367, and the third group between 110 and 155. So even though those incomes, for people here at Stanford might not strike you as super high, they are actually pretty high in the income distribution, just to give you some perspective. So the important thing to note is that of the 17-point increase, from 33 to 50% I showed you in the chart before, you have about 14 points is due to a surge in the top 1% that goes from 9 to a peak of 23 here in 2007. The next two groups have gained, particularly the next 4%, but you can see that it's just a couple points, very small relative to the gains that have taken place in the top 1%. Finally, to emphasize this concentration effect, the higher you go, the more extreme is the increase. So here, to give you something even more extreme, I look at the top 0.1% income share, and this one has increased from something like less than 3% to a peak, above 12%. So you see right there in the top 0.1%, you have almost a 10-point increase. That is a very large fraction of the total increase in the income share going to the top 10%. Now, the question you might ask me is that why do top income shares matter? Why do we care about how much top incomes are making relative to average? So the first and most important question, response is that inequality matters because people evaluate their economic well-being not in absolute terms, but relative to others. In other words, to put it simply, the public cares about inequality, and that's in part why those series indeed have had success or have been discussed in the public debate. If people didn't care about inequality, probably this wouldn't be a big deal, and I wouldn't be here tonight, giving a big lecture about it to a broader public. So that's the most important point. The second point regarding top incomes is that the surge in US top incomes has been so large that it really changes your view on the economic performance of the United States in the following way. That is, if you exclude the top 1%, the economic performance, if you will, of the bottom 99% looks a lot less strong as the economic performance of the overall economy. And as the 99% are by definition a very vast majority, it matters for the perception of the public. And finally, you can say on a political economy perspective that the surge in top incomes definitely gives top earners more resources and hence more ability to perhaps influence the political process. Think about think tanks, lobbying, campaign funds, etc. So Let me illustrate some of those things I just said, showing you some numbers for a recent period, that is 1993 to 2011. So if you look at overall real growth per family of cash, market, pre-tax income, the economic growth overall is not that great. It's only 13% over an 18-year period. Okay, so this looks a lot smaller than GDP numbers, in part because I've normalized it. It's by family, so the population growth. And cash market income doesn't include fringe benefits such as health insurance that have grown sharply over time. So in the end, when you look at cash market income, that is what people see coming to their bank accounts, it's before taxes. It's not that large of a growth. So now, of course, the top 1% has been doing a lot better, growing by 57% over that 18-year period, so that if you remove the top 1%, the bottom 99% is left with a growth of only about 6%. So you see slightly less than half the average growth in the economy. So in that sense, in a period of low growth, if you have very fast growth of the top 1%, it is going to reduce sharply the growth for the bottom 99%. And I want to point out, so this decomposes the period. But so let me just point out that, of course, the Great Recession hit top income earners sharply. They lost 36%, in that 2-year period. But even the bottom 99% was hit pretty hard. They lost 12%, which is something that had not been seen in the US since the Great Depression. This is really a very dramatic loss. Compare that to the small, much smaller, 6% fall, during the dot-com bubble. But what is striking is that coming out of the Great Recession through the recovery, the first 2 years of the recovery, it's a slow recovery, as we all know. And what is striking is that of this slow average growth, virtually, pretty much all of it has gone to the top 1%. That is, they've grown, about 11% in those first 2 years, with the bottom 99% essentially stagnating. I mean, they've stopped falling, but it's not like they've started growing yet, at least as of 2011. Another aspect that is important to emphasize is the change in the composition of top incomes over time. So this chart shows you again the top 0.1% income share, so if you look at the top chart here, but it decomposes it in every year into various components, such as realized capital gains, capital income, typically dividends and interest income, business income, that is part labor income and part returns on the assets of your business, and wages and salaries. And so what you see in this graph is that in the early part of the 20th century, most top incomes were composed of capital income. So this was a situation where the US, it was decades after the Gilded Age, where enormous fortunes were built, in large part through monopoly power. So you have the railroads, Stanford, and also, oil, et cetera. And so by the time you start, the 20th century, top incomes are either retired businessmen or heirs of great tycoons, from the Gilded Age. What you see is that a sharp drop in top capital incomes, and then the increase that we've seen, in recent decades has been driven to a large extent by labor income. So you see, for example, here the share of wages has increased sharply. The share of mixed income has also, part labor income has increased sharply. And even in capital gains, a lot of that today is labor income. So think about hedge fund managers, private equity managers who actually are working to manage assets, for clients, and are typically paid in the form of capital gains. So even though the level of income concentration today is comparable to what it was before the Great Depression, the composition has changed a lot, with the feeling that the new high-income people have worked, have worked for their high incomes, in contrast to the situation that prevailed at the time of the Great Depression. And that obviously is important for thinking about the taxation of top incomes in the political discussion. Okay, so what to expect next? So in the short run, as we've seen, top 1% income shares have fallen during the Great Recessions. In the medium run, based on the historical record I have described, top 1% incomes typically recover faster than bottom 99% incomes if there is no drastic change in tax or regulatory policies. So let me go back again, and show you this chart where you see very clearly, ups and downs following the business cycles, but those are temporary falls. And contrast that with what happened during the Great Depression and the afterwards, where you see top incomes do not recover, because here, the New Deal starts and very drastic policies, in particular, progressive taxation and regulations kick in. So what is the situation following the Great Recession? There have been indeed some changes, taxes on top incomes are increasing, starting precisely now in 2013. There has been financial regulation. What we can say is that probably the policy changes are small relative to what happened after the Great Depression. So we will see what happens in coming years to concentration of top incomes. Okay, so now let me give you some international perspective. So here in this chart, I'm showing you the top 1% income share for three countries, English-speaking countries. So the United States that we've already seen, the United Kingdom in red, and Canada in blue. And so what is striking in that chart is that all three countries have very similar patterns of income concentration changes over time. They all have that big U-shape, perhaps less extreme increases in the recent period, but definitely comparable. So you might think maybe this is a universal phenomenon, that countries do have this pattern of U-shape income concentration over time. That is actually not the case, because I'm showing you now three other countries using exactly the same scale for comparability, which is France, Japan, and Sweden. And so what is striking on this chart is that in the first part of the 20th century, the pattern is similar to the English-speaking countries. Namely, all three countries start with very high levels of income concentration. And actually, in this group of countries, of 6 countries, the record is for Sweden. Sweden has really income concentration that is off the charts 1 century ago. Even though Sweden is known, for its equality, it certainly didn't start that way. That was not the case 1 century ago. So all three countries experience, again, a big deconcentration of income that follows the historical vicissitudes of each of those countries. So, for example, in Japan, World War II is really the key factors that drives down income concentration. But now, the big contrast with the English-speaking countries is that in recent decades, there has been some increase but in income concentration. But as you can see, comparing the two charts, the magnitude of the increase is just very different. So why is that important? It's important because it shows you that there isn't a single pattern. That is, you cannot say that technological increase, such as new technologies or globalization, is driving up income concentration systematically. Because if that were the case, all countries should go through this. The world is more complicated than that. It's not only technological change, but it's also likely institutions in each country that interact with technological forces to shape the income distribution. And so the one that I'm going to discuss most is tax policy regarding top earners, okay? So top incomes and taxes. So just to motivate this discussion, so as I've shown you, pre-tax top US incomes have surged in recent decades, with top 1% income share more than doubling, from less than 10% 40 years ago to about 20% in recent years. And so that matters because now you can say that the debate on the proper taxation of top incomes is not only a matter of symbolism. Are we going to tax the rich a lot or not? It also matters for actual revenue raising. That is, it's not something, 20% of total reported income is not something you can ignore. It has big fiscal consequences. So to illustrate that, in 2010, top 1% earners paid for the federal individual income tax 20%, 22% on average of their income. And that's a big number because that means 2.6 GDP points. So if you do a mechanical computation, you would see that indeed increasing the top 1% tax rate from the current 22, say, to 33%, that is increasing it by half, would raise revenue by 1.3 GDP point, which is 200 billion per year, projected, based on the 10-year projection, that would be 2.5 trillion or more. So you see very big numbers relative to what was discussed in Washington, D.C. And indeed, what happened in the end, following the fiscal cliff negotiation and the healthcare surtax, on upper income, in 2013, top 1% income taxes will increase, taxes on top 1% incomes will increase by 0.4 GDP points. So you see 0.4 GDP point is about a third, of that potential increase that I discussed from 22 to 33%. So it's not a huge increase in rate for the top 1%, but it still brings in significant revenue. Okay, so now that I have motivated the budgetary consequences of taxing the rich, we need to address the economic question. What would happen if we were to significantly increase tax rates on upper incomes? So would that discourage economic activity or encourage tax avoidance? Through both effects, then, if those effects indeed are strong, you would see that as you increase top tax rates, pre-tax top incomes shrink, actually, so that in the end, the incomes reported at the top would not be as big, so that the mechanical computation that I have presented here would not be accurate. You wouldn't get as much revenue as projected. So what we economists have done is indeed try to analyze using all those data we've gathered in the World Top Income Database to see whether there is a systematic link between top incomes, tax policy, and the level of reported top income. So I'm just going to show you a couple graphs so to illustrate the approach. So here I'm putting, again, the top 1% income share in the US on this scale, along with a new series that shows you the top marginal tax rate for the federal individual income tax in red here on this scale. So that's, if you want, a crude measure of the marginal tax rates that we're applying to high and very high incomes. And so what you can see here with the series in red is that it is indeed the mirror image of the series in black. That is, when top pre-tax top incomes are low, that's exactly the time where top tax rates are high. And again, when they surge, the top rates have come down significantly. And again, when they started low, top incomes were very high. And I just want to point out really the magnitudes of the change. This scale goes from 0 to 100%, which means that in those post-war decades, the tax burden, really, if from the end of the Great Depression to 1981, the top marginal tax rate was above 60 and most of the time above 70%. You see, these are enormous changes relative to the debate that is taking place today, or that took place in the last 2 months, about what are we doing with the top tax rate. So what you see is that currently it was 35. It's going up to the level, of the Clinton, for ordinary income, and even a little bit more than that when you take into account the healthcare surtax on top income. So it's going to be the low 40s, but you can still see that those changes are small relative to the enormous historical changes. Okay, so just seeing this graph should convince you or give you, a strong sense that there is indeed a relationship, that is, when you increase substantially marginal tax rates on top earners, the top incomes pre-tax are going to be reduced, so that there is indeed a response. Now, what that implies depends on what is the mechanism driving the link between top tax rate policy and top income. So in this slide, I'm laying out 3 potential scenarios which have very different policy consequences. So the first scenario, the supply side scenario, says that top earners work less and therefore earn less when the top tax rate increases. So if that's the reason for the correlation I have just shown you, that means that top tax rate should not be high. It's counterproductive to have high tax rates on top earners. A second scenario that you often hear is tax avoidance or evasion. That is, top earners avoid or evade more when top tax rate increases. So that scenario has different policy implications than the first one, because in the first one, there's nothing the government can do to force talented people to work if taxes are high. In contrast, if the scenario is tax avoidance, tax evasion, the government has a lot of ability to shape, tax avoidance opportunities. And so if this is really the scenario, the critical thing to do would be to eliminate as much as possible tax avoidance or tax evasion opportunities. And really the debate shifts to whether it is possible, in the modern economy to do that successfully, within a country or through international cooperation across countries. And if you succeed to a large extent to cut, those avoidance opportunities, then you can possibly increase top tax rates in a second step. The third scenario I want to point out, which I call here rent-seeking, is the following. Top earners are able to extract more pay, to bargain harder, for higher compensation, but now at the expense of the rest of the economy, not by producing more, when top tax rates are low. The idea is that if top tax rates are very high, like they were, in the post-war decades, high-level executives doesn't have as much incentives to try to increase its pay, because most of it will go to the government in the form of taxes. In contrast, when top rates are lower, then it really pays to bargain harder for compensation increases. So if that, of course, that mechanism will drive a correlation between top incomes and top tax rates, but the policy implications are drastically different, because higher top tax rates decrease top incomes, but that's actually a good thing, because it means that those top incomes trickle down, if you want, are redistributed pre-tax towards bottom earners. So I've laid out those 3 scenarios, and as you see, it is critical to be able to know in which scenario we are to decide on the proper tax policy on top income. So I'm just going to show you in the rest of the talk some evidence to try to tease out which scenario we are in. I can't promise, I will have a definitive answer. This is research ongoing, but I want to show you some facts to get a grasp on this debate. So the first one I want to deal with is whether tax avoidance can explain everything. That's actually a criticism we've gotten, from conservative think tanks. Perhaps this pattern here of a U shape of income concentration is driven entirely by tax avoidance. That is, it's perhaps the case that here the rich were just as rich as they are now, but because taxes were so high, they were just finding ways to avoid reporting that income. So that in the end, inequality has not changed. What has changed is the level of tax avoidance. So how do we test, whether that indeed can explain the fact? So one way we can do it is as follows. If that's really the story, it means that if we are able to measure top incomes in a comprehensive way, that is including the portions of incomes that are avoided or hidden or reported in ways that are taxed more favorably, we shouldn't see as much of a U-shape. It should be more a flat pattern, uncorrelated with what has happened on the tax for ordinary income. That is, the correlation between taxes and top incomes should be much stronger when you look at the narrow taxable income definition than if you use a more comprehensive definition of income. So you can do that in an imperfect way by looking at series of income, including capital gains. So that's the black I started with. That's the comprehensive measure that includes realized capital gains that are tax favored, and compare it with top incomes on a narrow basis that does not include capital gains. So the white series really corresponds to taxable income taxed at those very high ordinary rates, the red series. And so what you can see is that overall, over the century, the pattern of correlation of the two series is very similar. So it's unlikely then that tax avoidance is driving the U-shape, because if it was all tax avoidance, at the time where it paid most to convert ordinary income into realized capital gains, because the gap between the tax rate on ordinary income and capital gains was just so enormous, we should have observed a lot of capital gains. And we do observe some, but not significantly more than we do observe today. So that's one element. You can do other things, such as looking at charitable giving. So this was a time when there was, there were the highest incentives for charitable giving. And yet, if you look at the numbers, what the rich were giving, was small relative to what the rich are giving now, that there are much fewer incentives. So it must be the case that indeed the rich today have more means to give, so suggesting that they have indeed become richer. So I don't think tax avoidance, I'm not going to say it plays no role, but probably does not explain a very large fraction of this overall U-shape. Now, supply side or rent seeking. If it's not tax avoidance, those are the two scenarios that are left. So really to tease apart those two scenarios, if you are in the rent-seeking scenario, the growth of top 1% incomes should come at the expense of the bottom 99%, and conversely. Okay, so it is indeed interesting to compare, the path of economic growth of top 1% incomes and bottom 99% incomes over the century. So that's what this chart is doing. So starting from a base 100 in 1913, we follow the real growth of bottom 99% income in white here and top 1% income in black over the century. So of course, one century after, in 2010, both groups have grown. They are about at 350 or 400, as we all know, as at least all economists know. In the long run, economic growth lifts all tides. That is, both groups have experienced, very significant growth. Real incomes have been multiplied by a factor 3.5 or 4 over the century. What is interesting in this graph is that it shows you that the pattern of growth is actually very different across eras. So typically, if you look at the end of the Great Depression, that is the start of the New Deal, to the 1970s, that's a period where bottom 99% incomes are growing very fast. Okay, so that's the period, as you remember, of very high tax rate, while top 1% incomes are growing actually very slowly. And then the pattern reverses itself starting in the late 1970s. So starting in the late 1970s, as we all know, economic growth slows down. So you see that bottom 99% income grow a lot smaller, but actually top 1% incomes grow very fast, especially starting in the 80s when the top tax rate come down. So this is not, of course, definitive proof, but it shows you that this idea that economic growth is going to lift all tides doesn't necessarily hold if you are looking at shorter periods, like a couple decades. And so this looks consistent. You know, it doesn't prove, but it looks consistent with the rent seeking. That is, the fate of one group depends negatively on the growth experience of the other group. All right, so to finish up, I would want to show you some international evidence taking advantage precisely of the world top income database we gathered. So we can look at the recent period and look at how top 1% pre-tax income shares have evolved relative to tax policy changes in each country. That is, by how much countries have cut their top marginal tax rate, and then what has happened to the surge in their top income. So this is what we do in this chart here, where we aligned, 18 advanced economies for which we have data, and we look at by how much they cut their top marginal tax rate on individual taxes using central and local governments from the early 60s to the recent period. So here you see you have the US and the UK that have the countries that have cut their top marginal tax rate the most. Actually, the world in 1960 is such that the US and the UK are the two countries in this group that tax top incomes the highest. Now, 40 years or 50 years later, they are among the countries that tax top incomes the lowest. So they've really done a fair bit of move. But you see, this is not a universal pattern. Some countries in Europe here have not changed much their top tax rate policy. And so what is striking in this graph is that you can see a very clear negative correlation. That is, the dots are aligned, roughly along a negative diagonal like this. That is, if you cut your top tax rates a lot, you do experience a sharp increase in top pre-tax, top 1% income share. So if you want, this is the cross-country counterpart to the time series analysis I showed before for the US. It's not only in the US that you have that correlation, it holds across a country. So at this stage, we economists can say, with pretty good confidence that there is indeed a strong link between top incomes, top tax rates, and top incomes. But what is harder, again, is to be able to say in which scenario we are in. So to finish up, I just want to show you a couple graphs, because in the end, deciding whether this was good policy or not for the US and the UK, you want to know what happens to the economy at large. That is, if you're in a supply side scenario, cutting top rates stimulates income and work at the top, so should generate higher economic growth. If we're in the rent-seeking scenario, it's not clear. Actually, in the pure rent-seeking scenario, more incomes goes to the top, but less at the bottom, and there is no effect on economic growth. So again, this is a very hard question to answer, but what I can show you, is, again, the same correlation with the cut in top tax rate, but now using here a measure of overall economic performance, which would be GDP per capita, real annual growth. So if I do it without controlling for anything, it's just a cloud, with no obvious correlation between this variable and this variable. And obviously, countries that start poor in 1960 grow a lot faster, Japan, Ireland, than countries that start rich, like Switzerland, US, or UK. So to have a fairer comparison, you want to control for initial level of economic of the GDP in 1960. So if you do it, you bring all the dots closer together, and then based on this graph, it doesn't look like there is much correlation. That is, if the supply side effect were really strong, we should see that these countries should have grown faster than those countries, it's overall pretty well aligned, meaning that in the last 45 years, the GDP per capita growth of countries like the US and the UK look comparable to a number of European countries which didn't experience, which didn't go through the same top tax rate policy and hence didn't experience the same increase in income concentration. So of course, this doesn't prove it. We economists know that it's hard to tease causality, from just cross-country regression, but I just want to show you the contrast. It's very easy for economists to find evidence that top tax rate policy affects top incomes. It's much harder for economists to find evidence that top tax rate policy affects economic performance. So to conclude, US historical evidence and international evidence shows that tax policy plays a key role in shaping the income gap. It's harder to find evidence on effects on economic growth. Obviously, even if you believe in the rent-seeking scenario in the modern globalized world, progressive taxation will require international coordination to keep tax avoidance evasion low. So I don't want to discard this issue, even if the publics really wanted to do higher taxes on top incomes, you would have to think carefully about tax evasion, tax avoidance consequences. And last, I want to finish by saying that will we see a drastic change in policy? That is really going to hinge on what the public believes. That is, my sense is that the public will favor more progressive taxation only if it is convinced that top income gains are detrimental to the 99%. That is, only if the public believes we are in the rent-seeking scenario will they ask for more progressive taxation. And so that's why telling apart whether we are in a supply-side scenario versus a rent-seeking scenario is so important for policy. So I've shown you some very preliminary evidence, and I very much hope that the data we've assembled and ingenuity from fellow economists will bring light to this critical policy question. Thank you very much.